someone who said, hey, I'm just gonna pray about that, but you knew they weren't. You knew they were just kind of using that as a smoke screen to avoid conflict or avoid taking on responsibility. Maybe one of the reasons you know that people do that is because you, like me, have done that in the past. Well, if you've never done that, then this video might just be for you, because we're gonna talk about why praying might not be the thing to do. Piqued your interest? Let's go. Over the last few videos, we've been looking at this idea of responsibility from a number of different angles. So once you've done watching this video, go back and check out those videos as well. It'll give you some more context for this conversation. But today we're going to look at one story in particular. And this story looks at three different types of people, and it looks at the different ways that these people approach the idea of responsibility. There's the religious people. Now, the religious people are the people who say, like we said in the intro, like, I'm going to pray about it. It sounds spiritual, but often it's just a way to scapegoat God for their irresponsibility. The second group of people this story addresses is those people who have misguided compassion. Don't get me wrong, the fact you're compassionate is incredible, but misguided compassion always says things like, well, if you knew their story, if you knew the childhood they'd had, you'd maybe cut them a little bit more slack. And that's not always bad, but often what this does is it facilitates irresponsibility. And people with misguided compassion actually fuel the irresponsibility of others around them. Then the final group of people are the people who say, hey, it's not my fault. And you're right, like you're dealing with the fallout of someone else's irresponsibility. You married them and you did all the right things, but then they made some decisions. Or, you didn't have a choice into the household you were born into, and your parents made some terrible decisions, and now you're living in the wake of irresponsibility. This story addresses that group as well. This story that we're looking at comes from this ancient document in the Old Testament called Joshua. And Joshua himself is actually a military leader of the nation of Israel. But Israel wasn't always this way. In fact, Joshua took over the reins from Israel's previous leader, Moses, who actually freed the Israelite nation from 400 years of slavery to the Egyptian people. And effectively what Joshua was doing was Joshua was leading the nation of Israel back to the promised land, back to their home ground. And they were effectively taking over nation after nation along the way back to the land they came from. Now, I totally get, to those of us who are living in the 21st century, we hear that and we think that's kind of a little bit barbaric. And I get that. I just wanted to give you the context for where this story is set. And if you want us to unpack maybe some of those contexts, those Old Testament things that seem a little bit weird, let us know in the comments below and we'll do it in a future video. So God, through Joshua, is leading the nation of Israel back to the promised land. And we pick up the story right after they've taken the city of Jericho. And typically what would happen in this period of history is if you took a city, you would take the spoils of that city. So you would take the gold, the silver, the livestock. But God says to the nation of Israel, no, I want you to leave that, because I don't want you to think that you've trusted yourself for this victory. I want you to know that you've trusted me. And there's one person. There's always one person, isn't there? His name's Achan. And Achan decides, you know what, I'm not going to listen to this. And so he took some of the gold and silver for himself and he hid it under a corner of his tent. So Joshua and his army move on to the next city, which is Ai. It's way smaller than Jericho. It should be an easy task for them. But they move on that town, they get absolutely pumped. They get destroyed. It is catastrophic how bad they lose this fight. And they go back to where their base camp was. And they do what so many people would do. They got down on their knees and they started praying. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but their prayer wasn't really like a prayer for help. It was really more of a prayer of blame. In fact, I wanted to read to you the prayer that Joshua prayed. He said, "O sovereign Lord, why did you bring us across the Jordan River if you're going to let the Amorites kill us? Lord, what can I say now that Israel has fled from its enemies? For when the Canaanites and all the other people were living in the land heard about it, they will surround us and wipe your name off the face of the earth." And then he says this, "And then what will happen to the honor of your great name?" In other words, it's like, how could you let this happen to us, God? It's going to look bad on you. People are not going to want to trust you. You're not going to look like this great, incredible God if you don't do something about it. And then God speaks to Joshua. He says, "Get up." Joshua's probably like, "What do you mean, get up? Like, I'm praying." God's like, no, don't say amen, don't finish. Get up. Why are you lying on your face like this? And then what God says next is so profound. He says, Israel has sinned. Now, we know that it's only Achan. And it kind of seems a little bit unfair, doesn't it? It's just like, well, hang on a minute, God, Israel hasn't sinned. Just one person has. But he goes on. He says, Israel has sinned and broken my covenant. They stole the things I told them not to steal. Get up, command the people to purify themselves in preparation for tomorrow. In other words, just tell them to find the stuff that's hidden somewhere and to get rid of it. You will never defeat your enemy until you remove these things from among you. Now, because you're not an Israelite, because you didn't steal it, you might be wondering, how does this apply to me? Well, let me make it crystal clear for everyone. And what we learn is that irresponsibility is a community thing. Now, you might look at that and think to yourself, yeah, but Chris, it's not fair that God punished the entire nation because of one person's irresponsibility. But the reality is everyone knew what their responsibility was. Everyone knew what was required of someone else, and there were implications when one person didn't follow through. And here's the bottom line that we can learn from this story, is we cannot tolerate irresponsibility. You can't tolerate it in your life, and I can't tolerate it in my life. Because the reality is the irresponsible person doesn't win, the people who are connected to that irresponsible person doesn't win, and no one else connected to them wins either. Now, you might be someone who's a Jesus follower and you're like, yeah, but Chris, I don't want to confront people and I don't think we're supposed to confront people, right? What, didn't Jesus not do that? The reality is you should probably read your New Testament a little bit more, because Jesus was always confronting people. Jesus was not tolerant of irresponsible people at all. And like I said at the start of this video, this story hits 3 people. So what I want to do now is I want to give each group a question to ask that will help you navigate other people's irresponsibility. For the religious group, the question I want you to ask is, are you hiding behind your prayers? Some of you pray things like, hey, should I be honest? Should I tell the truth? Should I have sex before marriage? Here's the thing. If God's already revealed it in His Word, you don't need to pray about that, because you already know what to do. And more than that, maybe a question you could ask is to think to yourself, if the people closest to me heard my prayers, would they look at me and go, that's a nice prayer, but you should actually do something about that? To the group who has misguided compassion, the question I would get you to ask is, are you compensating for irresponsibility? Don't get me wrong, I love the fact that you are so compassionate. The world needs more people like you. But one of the things that you need to wrestle through is the fact that you don't like conflict allowing someone else to get away with being irresponsible? Often the challenge in our culture is we love to psychoanalyze the decisions of other people, and then we do it to ourselves. And so what we can do is we can psychoanalyze ourselves out of actually having to have a conversation with someone where we hold them accountable. And for the group of people who say it's not my fault, here's the question I want you to wrestle with. What do you need to do with your own behavior? Because you're right. Some of you are living in the fallout of someone else's irresponsibility. But you also have a decision to make. Do you continue to live in the fallout of their responsibility? Or do you begin to take responsibility for the things that you can take responsibility for? Regardless of which one of those groups you sit in. Maybe what God is challenging you to do through this video is to say, hey, now is not the time to pray, but now is the time to get up, do something, and take responsibility for your life. Hey, if you like this video, why not give it a thumbs up and subscribe? And if you want to find out more about our community, the best place to do that is on our social media. We are at Beyond Church AU on Facebook and Instagram. Oh, that went down really far. Yeah,